Thank you for your time this afternoon. My name's Tim Papa. I'm a former profiler with the FBI, an agent with the FBI, with the Behavioral Analysis Unit. So what you're going to hear today is really more of a position paper. There's definitely a demonstration of this in some of my past work, but I'm revisiting a different way maybe to approach people we would maybe categorize as whistleblowers. And because I see an opportunity behaviorally um, to encourage whistleblowers or people who want to disclose information to share that. So this is conceptual narrative model to do that, but there's a lot of behavioral foundations that kind of cover, and then I'm going to put together this integrated model of how we would do that. So the outline is some background introduction, and then I'm kind of touching on a number of these things lightly. The literature in a number of these areas is can be pretty vast. Um, so I don't want that to be too dense. What one takeaway from this is kind of to rethink um, people who are obviously cyber criminals engaged in cyber espionage, those kind of labels. Maybe to think about them in a different way, especially if you're coming from government or law enforcement, because of the access they hold. That access is very valuable, and that information can truly impact the world and geopolitical relations in a lot of different ways. And it's not necessarily an audience I think people are looking at from the government's perspective. So I'm kind of touching on these things like the narratives of cyber criminal whistleblowers. Is there a different way to think about them in their narratives? And then some of the norms of whistleblowing and cyber espionage and some of these models of Russian and Chinese models of guilt and shame, understanding, of course, those are generalized, but some of the research literature in those areas is surprising. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about anticipated regret and then integrate anticipated regret and those other models of guilt and shame, those cultural models, into this conceptual narrative model for communicating to cyber criminals that in some kind of role or capacity might be assisting governments in cyber espionage. I know the title's a handful. I know even just thinking about that context is pretty complicated and dynamic. But again, I think there's a behavioral slice or space here to re-examine this. And then finally, an application of this narrative conceptual model to some theoretical scenarios to think about how might this look. So in terms of my background introduction, again, I was in the FBI for almost 16 years as an agent, in the last six as a profiler with the behavioral analysis unit. In my time as a profiler, I was mainly focused on cyber behaviors. Now, of course, there's foundations of behavioral analysis in criminology. If we're talking about like study of crime and criminals, legal systems, social systems, certainly that comes into play, especially when you're talking about people we call whistleblowers and people involved in cybercrime and people involved in cyber espionage. All those things that come into play. But really, that foundation is predominantly in victimology, which is that relationship between an offender and a victim. So whether we know an offender or not, or regardless of how much we know about a cyber offender, victimology is that starting place, right? Why did they choose that victim, and what does it say potentially about that offender? How does it shape what we know about them and the choices they make? And everything's individualized, of course. When I would do consultations in the past with BAU, even if we have these presuppositions about somebody and what they're doing and what their affiliations are, that approach always has to be individualized and based on behavior we can point to, behavior that's been documented, and all of that behavior in an aggregate over a period of time. So if we can look at pre-offense behavior, offense behavior, post-offense behavior, how did they make a decision, 20 years before when this was the situation in their life? And what does that reflect about them in terms of how they might make a decision now, given what we know or don't know about their life? Those are different perspectives to take. That's an aspect of how dynamic behavioral analysis is, even if it's not definitive, even if it's based only on the information we have access to. That's where you bring in these other theoretical frameworks and conceptual models to look at data, behavioral artifacts a little bit differently. That's where that rigor comes in, where there's an indirect application. But there's that blend of criminology and victimology in behavioral analysis. And based off of that analysis, that's where I would come up with these recommendations of maybe different ways to communicate to people that you're trying to reach, maybe different ways to communicate to influence them behaviorally, to do something, to come forward, to cooperate, whatever it might be. So, in terms of applying this methodology in behavioral analysis to different contexts and situations involving people who claim to be whistleblowers or they're disclosing information or they want to disclose information, those contexts did come up. Um, and those were generally in contexts overseas. And, that first step in analyzing that is comparing the behaviors we know about from that person and their presented or demonstrated motivations and reasons, um, in contrast or comparison to what we know in literature about whistleblowing behaviors. And when I would do that, some of the research literature was surprising to me because maybe I had some very generalized stereotypes in mind about what motivates whistleblowers and what kind of person is a whistleblower or someone who wants to disclose. So that's part of this position paper is to re-examine that to see are we missing some population and some opportunity to communicate to a special audience of people that have access to very sensitive information that if they shared it, that could truly make a beneficial or positive impact in the world in some way, right? Also, considering how people outside law enforcement are communicating to people that may call themselves whistleblowers, or maybe they're thinking about whistleblowing or disclosing, I would come across a lot of different communities in that respect, whether it was something like rewards for justice from the State Department or people who are activists or working at NGOs, and a number of them just don't have that perspective from law enforcement when we're also trying to make assessments about are people being deceptive or not. And also, certainly not just a bias potentially, but an obstacle in a lot of these engagements potentially from law enforcement with people who might be whistleblowers or they might want to share information about fraud and abuse that would be of value to us, right? Or the US government or somebody else is getting past that hurdle of like, but they're also cyber criminals or they're working in some capacity or affiliation with a foreign government. They're involved in some kind of espionage. Is that really a barrier? And is that barrier preventing us from reaching those kind of people who do have important information to share? So one part of this process for me is reimagining these narratives of cyber criminals, whistleblowers, and some of these faces you probably recognize, right? Like Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and Daniel Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers, and then the bottom left is someone who's known to be a cyber criminal, but would call themselves a hacktivist and leakist because of things that they leak that expose fraud out there in terms of how poorly data systems are managed and they weren't protected when they should have been protected. But that person's still indicted. This whole idea of like narratives, if you look at some of the work by Ajit Maan, who I've cited here, she kind of has a different approach on narratives where she would say that instead of trying to create narratives or create counter narratives, there are narratives that already exist in communities and in people. And that's what you're trying to land at, right? Like that's what you're trying to communicate that will resonate with them. So it's not always the message, it's just where you find meaning in the message. It's got to be meaningful to those people you're trying to reach, but it's already in them. It's kind of a different way to think about it. And certainly we want to think about this a little bit differently too, because again, if I'm not just stopping short of they're cyber criminals, they're involved in cyber espionage, they're affiliated in some manner with this foreign government. I also don't know the dynamic of that relationship, right? If it's something where someone's forced to do something or they've been pressured or they've been threatened. What's interesting too about looking at what makes norms or how things become normalized is some of these ideologies, of course, are just becoming more normalized because of these actions. Like what Edward Snowden did, obviously, there's differing opinions on it. And in terms of the justice system, they're still going to look at him in a particular kind of way in terms of what he did criminally. But maybe people nowadays have a different perspective on that. And maybe that's important to think about when you're thinking about strategic messaging and how you communicate to people like a Snowden potentially overseas that has information that they might want to share because they're seeing fraud and abuse or other things that are terrible that they want to share. Um, there is definitely a transdisciplinary approach to take in doing this analysis. And transdisciplinary, I think, is just an extension of interdisciplinary because you're not just talking about the research literature and some of those frameworks in different fields of research and study, but also a practical experience. And so I look at that in terms of my past or at that time being in law enforcement, being an agent, investigative experience, but also the research literature that I'm going to touch on today as well. Again, starting individualized, like what's their worldview? How do they make sense of things? Because someone's sense making is their filter too. It's how they interpret the world, right? How are they making meaning after different events that have happened in their life? All those things, if you know it or you think you know it about them, are important for how you craft that messaging to actually make them responsive to it, right? There's some kind of behavioral basis to it. You just don't really see this in the messaging out there. A lot of the messaging coming from governments is typically threatening, or it's just kind of open ended, as if those other communities and audiences are trying to reach trust a foreign government and they just have the same values or impressions of what's right and wrong, what's moral and ethical, doesn't really consider all the complexities and dynamics of someone's life story and their choices and their motivations. That communication and strategic messaging, from my own experience in the FBI, hasn't really been landing with people. I don't think they're as effective as they could be, and this is an opportunity to potentially revisit that from a different kind of approach. So, in terms of revisiting the norms of whistleblowing and cyber espionage, the literature on whistleblowing is interesting, generally speaking, because I think there are a lot of prevailing attitudes and beliefs about it out there that it's something where someone is not going through normal channels within an organization, so they just want to get this out there publicly to for fame, fortune, whatever it might be. That maybe it's not as stigmatized as it used to be, but the research would suggest otherwise. That a lot of people who do this do start by going through official channels, that they are so committed and invested in their mission and their organization that they want to see change and they see fraud and abuse by the people above them and they want to make a difference. A lot of people's attitudes toward this that we've seen in some of these research studies is that the only reason they would want to go to a third party is because they've had experienced retaliation within their own organization, or the people that they would go to weren't necessarily trustworthy enough to do anything about it. A little bit of a different perspective on what might be motivating them, and some of my time interacting with people outside of government space who have been whistleblowers, have talked a lot about like the isolation and loneliness that has come from becoming a whistleblower, and that this is, again, I think, is a reflection of society in general, especially in the US, not really understanding those kind of perspectives and what's truly driving people. And that's also, I think, the disconnect we see from a lot of official strategic messaging from the US government, is that they don't really understand or touch on the complexities and dynamic of individual lives of people and why they choose to do what they do. And that's why I think these general appeals don't really land with people. What was also interesting is some of the research in China, and although this is artificial and we're talking about lab based or studies within business schools and things like that, that while Americans might still be more likely to report fraud, we've seen an increase in the attitude of younger generations of Chinese being much more likely now to report fraud and whistleblowing. Older generations, not so much. And some of that's a reflection of, generally speaking, a collectivist society, speaking very generally, of not wanting to bring shame or attention to something, not wanting to cause trouble. But younger generations of Chinese, at least in these studies, they seem to be reflecting a different kind of behavior. And that was back in 2007. So again, generally speaking, people's intentions to whistleblow, it's really, actually, that's something you can get a sense of early on. And there are surprising findings in that. One example being the Russian Olympic doping scandal. Surprising to me, a number of the people who actually came forward were Russian athletes and Russian coaches. And from the outside, people who weren't aware of that, I'm sure that's surprising because it seems like majority of the offenders if that's what happened with the doping scandal, were Russian athletes, Russian coaches, but it's those athletes and coaches who probably faced the highest consequences for coming forward. So certainly there's cause to re-examine this and look at these narratives and the motivations a little bit differently. And further to the norms of like cyber espionage too, that's changed quite a bit too, because there seems to be a norm that's consented to at this point where among foreign governments, it's okay because everyone's going to do it as long as you don't sell that data you've stolen to criminal enterprises, right? To go after someone individually, because otherwise they wouldn't will keep doing it, right? It's become acceptable in a sense. And again, this might be another example of you can normalize some practices by simply calling it a norm. Yeah, it depends who's calling it a norm, but that's important to note, right? And cyber espionage has had other impacts on these geopolitical relationships because in some situations it's kind of been a release valve for countries where there's been something like a jet was shot down accidentally and they need to do something in response. So maybe instead of firing missiles, they launch some cyber attacks against the infrastructure of the other country. And so at least there's some saving face there or some kind of response. But this is a place where norms can kind of be reestablished and shaped in a different way. And I see the same opportunity here potentially. And when you're talking about Russian and Chinese models of guilt and shame, these are commonly obviously recognized as negative emotions, but they are still mechanisms of persuasion, right? They still persuade people and influence people. But generally speaking, the models of guilt and shame in the US are quite different than models of guilt and shame in some other countries and cultures, in particular Russia and China. Now, some of the research they've done in Russia has been quite broad in terms of looking at like shame and guilt in those kind of cultures. When they look at the conflict in Ukraine, if you're from an out group and you're not part of that community, trying to shame Russians about the war. That has not been found to be very effective. And there's been a number of Russian influencers who've supported that conflict in Ukraine, and that has been influential on people. But they've seen in some recent studies that whenever you look at this a little bit differently in as an in-group peer member of that group, right, a Russian in a community, whenever you're looking at it in terms of is there any responsibility because of what the Russian government continues to do, because it's your government and it's your country, if they're committing war crimes, do you have any responsibility for that? And they've seen a softening of Russian attitudes in some studies for that, especially when you look at it in terms of the responsibility being individualized for that person, like their choices, I guess who they vote for. I don't know enough about politics in Russia to know if that really has any impact whatsoever. But again, that could all change again if you're considering a context of a cyber criminal who is facilitating cyber espionage for Russia in some sense. You can make that responsibility individualized. This is an example of how you can take some, broadly speaking, general research reflective of human behavior and potentially apply it to someone's individual case. With shame, definitely a little bit different in generally speaking some Chinese collectivistic cultures, even if that's changing in some sense among younger generations. But interestingly, whereas, guilt, if you think about it in terms of guilt, you feel guilt because there's been some transgression. You've transgressed somebody and you want to make it up to them and you want to do something about it. That can be very motivating, especially in, say, generally speaking, in the US, in more of an individualistic type of society or culture. But in Asian cultures and in Chinese cultures for these studies, shame seemed to be more of a mechanism of persuasion. And that was an appropriate emotional response to failure. It's kind of like if you fail, are you also representing your family in that failure? Yes, in a way. Um, and that is a feeling that's valued, right? That shame is much more motivating and can result in much more adaptive behavior than guilt in generally speaking Chinese cultures, and this is a model. There's other taxonomy too here in terms of shame and guilt with Chinese words, including one that means deep shame. So there can be different degrees or variations of how that shame is experienced and felt. but it's a very powerful negative emotion. A lot of people don't always think about guilt and shame as motivating emotions, but they are. They're very powerful, especially if there's an option for you to do something about it. And that's a common, consistent thing. And even fear appeals, causing fear in someone is really only impactful if you provide some option for them to do something about that fear that they're facing. Anticipated regret is kinda the last part, this model to consider, because when you're thinking about people's attitudes towards something, you're trying to evaluate how likely is it that they're gonna do something, and what's their attitude towards disclosing sensitive information. Well, you would wanna consider their attitude, but also what the people closest to them believe and think about that, and then how much control do they even have over that in terms of access to information? What kind of consequences would they face? I'm talking about a model of theory of planned behavior. That's pretty established where they talk about that. The final piece to that has been research on anticipated regret, and it often can be one of the greatest influences on someone's intention to do something. A great parallel to this is like research on piracy behaviors, where in the past it used to be looked at from a perspective of it being moral or ethical. But in the past 20 years, research on piracy behaviors has changed quite a bit. And it's focused much more on what I've talked about, like what's their attitude towards it? What do the people closest to them think about it? They're in a group and there's relationships there. What do those people feel about it? And again, how much control do they have over it? It's kind of like soft lifting, which is a form of piracy behavior, but it's sharing passwords on like Netflix accounts. Well, you might presume that someone in law enforcement would never do such a thing. Well, they might be mistaken about it because the general attitude towards doing that is, well, yeah, it's fine, I guess, if you share it with it's my family members. Why not? It's not hurting anyone. It's a huge corporation. I'm not going to get in trouble for it. That's an example of a display or demonstration of that attitude and what the norms are among people close to you, what they think and feel about it, and how much control you have over it. That would be a demonstration of that. Anticipated regret, though, is kind of on the tail end. And when they've looked at that, what we're really talking about is what kind of regret are you going to feel and experience as a result of one of your choices? What's really important about that is knowing that you're going to find out what the result is of that choice. It's kind of like you have 2 companies you're trying to get hired by, and they both are gonna offer you a bonus. If you choose company A, but you never find out what company B's bonus is gonna be, that's not such a difficult decision for people to make because they never would find out what it is anyway. Like, if they would have made more money in a bonus from company B if they had chosen that. But if you tell them, and they've done this in studies, you can choose one company and you can't change your choice, and then afterwards you're gonna find out what the other company would have given you, that becomes a much harder choice for people because they're already thinking about and ruminating and anticipating the regret they might feel. It makes the decision that much more difficult. And this potentially can be used to influence someone's decision making, especially if you make it individualized. So I know that's like quite a mountain of different models of research literature into these different areas. But a lot of this should resonate with you because more than likely, yes, you've experienced these things in your life too. So some of this should really make sense to you, generally speaking, of how people are. If we move beyond these labels of cyber criminal, foreign national, right? Like people are going to be responsive to this stuff behaviorally if you individualize it within their cultural and relational setting. Can we integrate these together, shame and guilt with anticipated regret, into something like anticipated shame and guilt? Right? So again, there's a broad taxonomy here of different mechanisms of persuasion and what kind of negative emotions motivate people. But again, there's got to be an option there to do something about it. And you can do that in terms of crafting strategic messaging to cyber criminals who are involved in some kind of cyber espionage. If you focus on some aspect of something that they might think is illegal, immoral, unethical, fraud, abuse, whatever it might be that might resonate with them, and then give them the option to do something about it, which in this case would be to safely and securely share that information or leak it or disclose it to somebody or to the public. Anticipated guilt and shame could have the same kind of influence on someone as actual guilt and shame feelings. They've seen that in their studies of this, but again, this could be even amplified further if you think about the way the person you're focusing on what life experiences they've had, what they're going through right now, the affect they're experiencing. And when you combine this with narrative persuasion is just another framing technique in terms of how you communicate or message people. So it's much different than just being like informational or logical, right? Like these are the pros and cons of doing this. This is why you should do that. Or here's information. This is what you should do. Well, narrative persuasion is going to be a coherent story with characters. And it doesn't have to be real, it can be fictional, it can still be influential to people. And those characters typically are people that, if you're reading it or watching it or listening to it, then maybe you can connect with them in some way or it reminds you of something in your life. That's how narrative persuasion is impactful and influential. It's an entertaining way to communicate something to someone that can result in some kind of behavior change, right? And people don't scrutinize it as much, right? Because it's entertaining to them and it's a story. What you typically find in narrative persuasion too is people including cautionary tales, right? Like this is what happened to this person. They were doing this. This is what happened. This is the choice they made. This is why you should make a different choice. That could be an example of it, but it's told in a story format. And again, when it's controllable behaviors where people actually have a choice in those stories, it can influence people even more. And what I'm talking about here is presenting real stories of people like them that have been in similar situations with similar backgrounds, similar life experiences, having to make choices. This is much different than an official from the government saying, you better watch your back, or we're going to get you, you better stop this stuff. Like threatening language, warnings. That's what you typically see after like a big law enforcement takedown. But this is a different approach. This is not a performance during a press conference highlighting metrics and how great we worked with our partners. A lot of that messaging is for domestic partners and for the public to say we're actually doing something about this, and look how well we work together, and so worked with us on it. That's important, that's gonna happen. But if you're actually trying to communicate and message to audiences like this that can have a true impact based on their access, you've got to really focus on them specifically, what they've lived through and what other people like them have lived through. That's how you frame content and communication with narrative persuasion. So this is what this conceptual narrative model for cyber criminals involved in some capacity of cyber espionage. This is how you would structure and apply that model. The first step would be to behaviorally assess that cyber criminal. And this would be everything that you could potentially point to their life in terms of their attitude towards something, their life experiences, their relationships. I've been in both situations where either I know hardly anything about them other than the few things on social media, or I know a lot about them. But you can use the same kind of approach here, because this is where you can bring in other theoretical frameworks on human behavior to apply to the data you do have that might suggest this is maybe their attitude towards this, or this is might be what they choose to do, or this might be how how they made meaning from that kind of experience. But you've got to have that behavioral basis first. The second thing is, could there be any kind of government behavior, whoever they're assisting in cyber espionage, that could be interpreted as by them as fraud or immoral? And I know that could depend on the framing and the perspective you take on it, but you've got to take their perspective as well and think about their potential motivations of why they might want to disclose that, or why they might think this is wrong, even though maybe they don't really have a choice in the role they have assisting cyber espionage. The third step is applying a model of anticipated shame or guilt that's appropriate for their culture and their relational context, meaning the relationships that they're in, their family and friends. Those are emotional levers that can really influence people. That's where I've really seen people's decision making come down to, that the decision they make, how is it going to impact the people they love that are closest to them? But of course, it's got to be culturally relevant too, to the model of shame or guilt we're talking about. So, can we apply a model of anticipated shame or guilt in that messaging? And then the fourth thing is, let me just move this box, integrating this behavioral analysis with that anticipated shame or guilt model with narrative persuasion to create strategic messaging or communication or content designed for them, something that's going to resonate with them, something that's going to motivate them, right? So this could definitely be applied in individual examples for people who might be considering this. There might be reason to believe, or people have information. I'm not just talking about people in government, be people outside of government, that people in this cyber criminal universe have these dynamic roles or affiliations or complicated roles and affiliations with foreign governments, and some of it's willing and some of it's not. But people can change and things can change in their life. And those might be opportune moments to disclose, if they have an option to do that, information that's really important for the public to know. The final aspect here is just thinking theoretically about, well, what might this look like in terms of looking at a foreign government that might be involved in something that even a cyber criminal who's, yes, doing something criminally based on these different legal systems could also still see as that's wrong and I want to do something about it. I'm talking about an audience segment that people wouldn't ordinarily consider, but they actually have some of the greatest access to some of the most sensitive information that could really make an impact. If there's something wrong going on in the world against a certain population, they might know about it and they would have the means to do something about it and to be able to do it securely because of their technical expertise, generally speaking. So, one theoretical scenario could be corrupt anti corruption Chinese officials, right? There are these big anti corruption pushes in China and people who hold those positions in government looking for corruption, but many of these officials are corrupt themselves, right? So, if you have a situation where there's someone living in a particular province in China, and whatever that corrupt official is doing that could be impacting the lives and the family of that cyber criminal could cause him or her to change their position on something, to change their attitude towards something. And maybe they want to reveal something that puts this person out of that position or makes some kind of difference. It's not something that's black and white and clean necessarily. This would be that kind of dynamic situation where there's literally no messaging crafted for someone in that kind of position, but they actually probably would look to do something about this, and it would be hard for them to do it otherwise without disclosing or whistleblowing through a safe and secure channel. Another example could be Russian officials that are involved in things like conscription, but they're excluding their own sons from conscription through bribery or corruption or things like that, right? Now you have cyber criminals that have a dynamic range of affiliations and relationships with the Russian government and the Russian military, but they might have suffered loss in their own family. There could be a cyber criminal whose brother was killed because he was forced into conscription. And that could be a life event that dramatically changes the attitudes and beliefs and choices of that cyber criminal. But nobody's really messaging to them. And maybe a final third example, theoretically, is looking at something like Chinese forced Southeast Asian labor, right? If you have Chinese officials that are trying to court various Southeast Asian countries for support in the South China Sea, but then you start having these reports come out with these state-owned Chinese enterprises that are, hiring people at basically slave wages to do forced labor, and a lot of people are dying from it. These could be family members and friends of people who are also Chinese cyber criminals who have assisted the state in some way in the past or currently, or they could just see this as wrong or that's going too far. We don't typically consider those kind of narratives. Again, you don't have to be in government to create this kind of messaging to reach these kind of people. But those would be examples of applying that theoretically. Again, thank you for your time. I know this is a position paper. It's a conceptual model. I don't have data that I'm applying it to here, but anecdotally, this has relevance in terms of being behaviorally impactful in people. So if there's any questions, I'm welcome to take those.
Thank you, team. We may have time for only one question before the next session. This is a question from Athena. How profiling is used in the fight against attackers and whistleblowers?
Um, Generally speaking, if profiling is used in terms of trying to create some kind of behavioral assessment as a starting point. So if there's an objective, say an investigation, where it's like, oh, we want to stop this cyber attacker, or we want to prevent them from attacking some other kind of victim over here, anything that you come up with, like an investigative technique, an investigative strategy, a way to communicate with them, a way to engage with them, a starting point is that behavioral profile. And that's going to be based on anything we can find or know about that person to try and understand who they are, how they see themselves, the kind of person they want to be, choices they've made before, things that motivate them in life. All that stuff could be crucial in terms of coming up with an approach, a strategy for a different way to speak to them where they may actually be responsive to that. It may actually motivate them or influence them. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, team. So, okay, our next session will begin in 5 minutes, and this is our last panel discussion. So I will see you later. Thank you, team, for your
Yeah.
presentation.
Thank you, Kendra. Thank
Thank
you,
you,
everyone.
everyone. Bye bye.